Hi, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to the Risk Awareness Week 2025. We're kicking off with an amazing keynote session with Leah Tillman. Leah is the chairman and CEO of Agilian Systems, an advanced technology and strategic advisory firm. Leah is an American financier, author, entrepreneur, who advises companies, governments, and institutional investors globally. He has previously held positions at BlackRock and Bear Stearns, where he was the chief institutional strategist and senior managing director. He's the author of 4 books, including Agility in 2019 with General Chuck Jacoby and Financial Darwinism in 2008. Holds a BA and MA in mathematics from Columbia University, where he also did some teaching, and profiled as a business visionary by Forbes and honored as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum. Welcome, Leah. What an amazing start to the Risk Awareness Week.
Listen, great to be here, and congratulations on shaping this event, making it one of the landmark events in the space.
Thank you. And I was particularly excited to have you because you started your career in risk management before the financial crisis. So I think before that, very pivotal point in our careers where the regulators decided to step in and introduce additional views and perceptions on what risk management should look like. So can you please just kick off with sharing a little bit of a kind of background story on what was risk management designed for? What was it intended to be like before Basel came into the picture?
Listen, early 90s were an exciting time. I only compare it to the intellectual excitement of this current moment as it relates to AI. But in the early 90s, when you did not have books on risk management and quantitative finance, it was the emergence of a new field. And the new field was building on the research in portfolio theory and things of that kind in prior decades, but it was all oriented toward decision making, right? You needed to identify the risk drivers that should be observable, measurable, and actionable, right? And embedded first in portfolio management on the asset management side, and then broadly into corporate finance. So the whole purpose of risk management was to illuminate the reality and then make it actionable for decision makers. And it is our observation that that's how it evolved for the first decade or so. And then the financial crisis happened, and then regulation kind of took over. And what used to be a tool for decision making became the tool for governance and risk control, more so than decision making. And now we're finding ourselves 10, 15 years later, again, trying to revive that original purpose, because that's what boards and executive teams are truly looking for at this moment of disruption and uncertainty.
And I think, don't you just love that, how the world goes, like the life goes in cycles? It was about decision making, then it became about compliance and regulatory reporting and reserves and extra regulatory protection for the customers. And now we're kind of going back into the cycle and again trying to make it useful, not just for the external reporting, but for the internal publications. I'm very curious to learn a little bit more about some of the kind of exciting applications of risk-based thinking in decision making in your professional career. What was like the big standout applications of proper risk management?
Well, again, in the beginning, it was all about defining risk in ways that are useful, right? And you probably remember a great deal of experimentation that came originally from CAPM, right? And then it became the arbitrage pricing theory, where instead of just thinking about the world in terms of equity indices, you could define risk factors in any shape or form, right? So it became almost a point combination of art and science for risk managers to define risks in ways that are, on the one hand, rigorous and lend themselves to measurement and management, on the other hand, in ways that are intuitive for decision makers. Because one of the prerequisites to anything we do is to make it intuitive and practical enough so that non-quantitative decision makers who have a great deal of experience and intuition about these things can actually find it useful. So if you want to geek out for a second, you probably remember this entire endeavor with principal components, which are amazingly effective tools to take a huge multidimensional space and reduce it to something that is really simple, with one caveat, that principal components are not particularly intuitive, right? So all of a sudden you are stuck between hundreds of factors that are intuitive and observable, and a handful of really powerful explanatory variables that are not, right? So it's been a path of this kind, but the way it kind of gravitated toward enterprise risk management is quite a departure from the original thinking, right? It became all oriented toward governance. Risk factors became defined in ways that are not observable and are so general, typically, that are almost useless, right? And I think that's the moment in time that we find ourselves today, where on the one hand, boards and executive teams realize that this is a very different kind of environment, and they need all of these tools to truly navigate disruption, uncertainty, intensify, and change. On the other hand, all of these practices that have been institutionalized cannot possibly get you there. So how do you resolve that?
And that I think is, I just want everybody to take that away, because this is a very, very powerful message. Is that on one side, we live in a much more uncertain, riskier, volatile world today. And on the other side, the tools that we now call risk management, or that we are forced to call risk management today, were never really designed for decision making. So they may not be helpful. They may not give you the insights that you need to make better choices. So cast in mind back to your experience and to the conversations you're having today with the clients that you're working with. What are some of the things, some of the ideas, some of the applications that do work? What are the things that bring us to the first principles and help us make better choices?
Well, again, it all starts with how an organization defines its enterprise portfolio of risks. And again, you can have these two realities coexist. You can have the existing sort of accounting-based or governance-based reality exist for certain kinds of risk control purposes, and that's fine. You don't need to discard it. But on the other hand, right, you introduce a separate way of sort of defining risks and integrating them across organizational structures. So that's where the conversation starts. That makes it practical and makes it even possible to have a conversation on how enterprise level risks cascade down to some of the more granular risks that are managed by different folks within the organization, but they all eventually come up to have a cohesive and integrated portfolio of risks. Once you do that, you can take it in a number of ways. On the one hand, you can connect it to strategy and planning. I think one of the biggest disconnects that currently exists pretty much universally is the fact that the world of enterprise risk management is completely separate from the world of strategy development and planning. And the questions of how could interest rates append my balance sheet are certainly a part of this conversation. But what environmental changes in terms of geopolitics, in terms of technology, in terms of societal changes can append my strategy? Those kinds of questions are not necessarily asked. And again, there is a separate disconnect between strategy and planning. So truly unifying these three key areas of sort of focus for any company:
Mm.
planning, strategy in risk is one of them. Transforming the conversation from point estimates to probability distributions,
Yeah.
as basic as it sounds, given the history of risk, is still there, right? If you look at the dominant practices of managing earnings for a large complex organization, it's based on some sort of bottom-up, spreadsheet-based forecasting that at best will talk about point estimates and maybe some of the scenarios around it, but it will not have a conversation on what used to be called earnings at risk.
Yeah, uncertainty surrounding the
Right.
assumptions. Yeah.
What are the opportunities around that? How would you manage that distribution of earnings now that it's not just a function of balance sheet and traditional exposures, but it's a function of global factors, et cetera? And I think we're also at a moment in time where a lot of these ideas that kind of have been lost or forgotten can be brought to the forefront through AI and through democratization of knowledge. So we are trying to pursue a holistic way of doing that along a number of verticals that are all converging to this kind of support, decision support for boards and executive teams.
You've said so many important messages that because we are kind of on the same page, I immediately recognize the significance of what you're saying, but we really need to spell it out for our audience as well, because you've mentioned some groundbreaking concepts that completely flip the whole risk management, today's ERM risk management on its head. So let's maybe spend a little bit of time just unpacking each one, because the first important message that you mentioned is that there is demand, there is an expectation of some sort of risk management for the governance sake. So there's some paperwork, there's some sort of artifacts and documents that external parties and even maybe the board expect us to have as risk professionals. And we're not really advocating for putting all of that in the bin. We're just recognizing that this is a separate world, and I call it, for simplicity, I call it risk management one. And you do it for your objective becomes to do it as quickly as physically possible, because it needs to be there, but it has very limited value to the actual underlying strategy. And I think this is the space where AI can help a lot. Like, you can automate most of governance risk with AI. And then risk management 2 is this other parallel universe with different tools, different metrics, different timing, different competencies even, and different participants as well, where you actually try to inform the strategy, the business plans, the budgets with this risk thinking. So that's the first point, is that it's not one or the other, it's two simultaneously, but you hopefully spend 10% on risk management 1 and 90% on risk management 2 if you can. But then the second fundamental point that you mentioned, and again, this is groundbreaking, because at Risk Awareness Week, ever since 2019, we've been talking about ranges and distributions and simulating rather than just adding single point estimates. But somehow that message is really not getting across. And I think this is an important kind of learning point that we need to stop and talk a little bit about. Business plans today are all single scenarios. And sometimes on the back of it, they may run some sensitivity or a couple of scenarios just to kind of compare. But the world is not deterministic. It's not a single scenario. There's volatility, there's uncertainty around every single assumption that is put inside the strategy and the business plan. And we really need to move towards thinking in ranges, calculating in ranges, and making conclusions in ranges with some sort of confidence interval, saying that this looks like a better option 70% of the time, and 30% of the time it's actually not a good option if certain things happened. How are you? I want to learn more from you. How do you kind of bring these concepts of thinking stochastically versus thinking deterministically, which has been the traditional way of doing business for forever?
Well, you need to, first of all, illustrate a defensible way to create these estimates. I think one of the biggest challenges is, because of the way that risk is defined, it cannot be measured. And therefore, you are resorting to this purely subjective conversation about likelihood, which you're assigning almost arbitrarily, right? And consequences which are also defined in very broad terms, right? So you cannot possibly define in a measurable probability distribution based on that kind of a conversation. So you need the underlying models that will come in and either for earnings risk or balance sheet risk or operational risk create actual measurement, right? So I think that's one problem. And then the second problem is that whatever tools you use have to have interpretive power, right? So when we create these probability distributions of revenues and earnings, there's a great deal of conversation on what are the factors that drive it, or historically, or in a forward-looking way. How would you interpret these results? How would you interpret the assumptions, et cetera? So on the one hand, I think trying to take the existing risk management strategies and tools in convert them into probability distribution is sometimes impossible, just the way, because of the way it was developed. On the other hand, right, you have very few practitioners who are spending time and resources developing these tools and then presenting them to boards and executives for decisions, because the nirvana, as you said, is here's our probability distribution 6 months from now, uh, uh, 12 months from now, et cetera. We're considering an M&A transaction. How would it change this distribution? We're considering a vertical integration. How would it change this distribution? How would this distribution change if we believe we're going into an environment that is similar to COVID or similar to the global financial crisis, right? So once you have the model, you can have these conversations. But models like these are very rare, right? And it takes a special kind of skill set to come and present them and reframe what's purely a technical conversation into a business conversation.
Do you think AI can help with converting the technical kind of calculation, the estimates into business language?
No, I actually don't. I think AI, it's actually interesting because we have these conversations internally that AI needs its own translation
Mhm.
mechanism from the results and from the assumptions to decision making. So I'm not sure if AI will bridge that gap. I think it takes sort of this dual expertise in risk management and the nitty gritty of it, of how the models are built and how all of this is measured and managed, and the business expertise to know to make that jump and say, this is a tool for evaluating the next M&A transaction, evaluating the next balance sheet restructuring, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm. That's a good point. And during the Risk Awareness Week, we're trying to bring a group of wide-ranging experts from different fields who are all trying to help our participants to kind of understand and appreciate how to translate what are some of the important competencies to have, and kind of be a deep dive into some of the technicalities of doing quantitative risk analysis. Um, do you mind sharing some stories of integrating risk information into the strategic planning, into the strategy? Because that I think is such a powerful application, and almost like a direct connection to the cash flow of the company. The choices that are made strategically, it has such a huge influence, and often this is done kind of completely disconnected from this separate wealth of information that the risk managers and the auditors and the internal control experts are sitting on, but this is never kind of used in the strategy conversation.
Sure, sure. Well, two come to mind. One is 2000 to 2001, where you find yourself in an environment where the government is printing money, supply chains are blocked after COVID, people have disposable income. And we're sitting there thinking about this environment, and it's becoming pretty clear that the only outcome of an environment like this is inflation or stagflation. depending on how things play out with the economy. We have a conversation like this with a number of our clients, and we simply ask them, what would be the impact of inflation on your earnings, on your balance sheet? Um, and folks had very difficult time answering that question, which in turn brought up a different conversation on, in a broader sense, do you understand the geopolitical, macroeconomic, and other kinds of macro drivers of your performance over time? And um, in the vast majority of cases that we have seen, folks did not have the right tools to do that. Hence the conversation about probability distributions and that kind of modeling. But that was a direct conversation on integrating a risk factor conversation into strategy and into strategic planning. And some of the clients that jumped on it fared really well in the following years of intensifying inflation and market movements around it, and then sort of central bank reactions, etc. So that would be a macro version of that. Another version of that would be the entrance of SpaceX into the aerospace and defense industry. Uh, so totally different kind of a risk factor, a disruptive competitor risk factor rather than a macro factor. And what happened was uh, that emergence of SpaceX was almost universally dismissed by the legacy players. They essentially said nobody's going to take these guys seriously. They're going around blowing up rockets and satellites. I mean, nobody's going to give them a government contract. And what was misunderstood at the time was how an emergence of a disruptive competitor who had an entirely different mode of operation, mode of engaging clients, and mode of innovation and experimentation, how it completely redefined the competitive landscape and completely redefined, actually, interestingly, clients' risk appetite. And by the time it all became clear, a lot of these folks were uh, way beyond sort of recapturing some of these market shares. So again, the conversation of an environmental change of any kind, which could be driven by technology, competition, macro factors, how it's captured by the organization, how it's processed by the organization, and how you react was the whole point of the concept of agility that we came up with a number of years ago, and what it takes for an organization to develop a routine process of how you study the environment, you detect these kinds of changes, and then you process them and react to them.
And so I really like that idea of a systematic process of ongoing monitoring of changes in key assumptions or key influences that affect the business, the business model. So let's let's unpack this a little bit. There are essentially two applications of risk management and strategic planning. Is whenever the strategy is being created, originated, there are a lot of assumptions that go into the kind of the forecasting to understand whether the business model is viable or not. And most of these assumptions are actually uncertain, and in reality should really be represented as probability distributions, so we can estimate the kind of the range of potential future outcomes. And one of my favorite phrases that I repeat at every conference is that the future is plural. We really need to kind of shift our mindset to thinking that there's no single future, there are multiple possible futures. And by understanding the kind of the complexity and the range of the futures, we can be better prepared for all the kind of edge case scenarios. So there's one risk management for informing the original strategy design to try to simulate what happens to the strategy if different assumptions change. And then there's the separate risk management, which happens afterwards, once the strategy has been decided on, and that's been converted into a business plan, into a budget, into some sort of operational metrics. It then becomes an exercise of understanding what are the biggest influences and kind of being on the lookout what tweet or what government regulation may actually affect that underlying assumptions. And we live in an amazing time where a single tweet can cost billions and sometimes trillions. I mean, that is really something. What else? You're having and I think I'm particularly curious. You've been doing this for a very, very long time, and we do. I feel now live in a much riskier world in every sense, in geopolitical sense, in economic sense. Many of the cycles, the empire cycles, many of those cycles are coming to the end, and the end is usually not pretty. What are you sensing? What are you seeing in the conversations with clients, with your colleagues, with the other senior risk managers that you interact with? Are you seeing anything different in the recent times?
So what's recent in what's different in recent times is the focus on geopolitics and technology, right? And you've already seen investment banks and others setting up think tanks and institutes to essentially advise clients on that, right? And it's useful and it's general sort of knowledge and it's general attention to drivers of disruption, and that's great. What is not happening is the actual mapping of this knowledge onto the specifics of a particular enterprise, right? So one of the good examples is, there is a conference call on something that is happening in Europe or Iran or elsewhere, right? And there's some useful knowledge that is being discussed. People hang up that phone and they say, okay, so what do I do now? Who do I call to even discuss that? And then typically these signals kind of die on the vine, right? Of course, is the opposite approach is needed, and those types of approaches are well understood in the military and in the intelligence community space, where first you will come in and try to answer the question of what factors in the environment matter to me, right? So we've developed this whole multidisciplinary approach. Some of it comes from business, and some of it comes from risk management, and some of it comes from the military and intelligence, where you come in and systematically analyze the enterprise and distill what knowledge is needed to successfully manage it. All of the assumptions embedded in strategy, just like you said, Alex, are part of it, but it's a broader conversation, right? And then you need a dedicated resource, internal or external, that will come in, take the set of these environmental factors that matter, and systematically look at them, surveil them, fuse them, integrate, and then insert back into the functioning of the organization. That is non-existent, pretty much, across the private sector in general, right? I mean, you have certain elements of it where you have a corporate center focused on geopolitics or focused on wargaming, but typically these are still siloed exercises and they don't comprehensively address this on the enterprise level. So in the beginning of that process, which eventually becomes risk management, right, is the environmental intelligence process that is also missing. So I'll tell you one story which is particularly interesting. I was giving a talk to a set of global board members from large complex organizations around the world. We were having exactly this conversation on how we better detect changes in the environment, and then how we better process them, and how we escalate them to the right decision makers. And here's the set of decisions that come out of it, which could be action or contingency plans or whatever the case may be. They kept repeating the same thing to me over and over again, which is, we're not structured for that. we're not structured for agility. The way that we operate, some of it because of regulation, some of it because of history, some of it because of whatever, is not that. We don't have a funnel internally that takes in all the inputs from the environment, internally, externally, and then processes it and thinks about it and then prioritizes it and then puts it up for decision making. And therefore, we're constantly behind the curve, right? We have been late to supply chains. We've been late to pandemics. We've been late to geopolitical disruption. When that happens, we start fighting fires. So it really is destructive to the organization. So the outcomes of this are clear and well understood, but I think a lot of folks don't quite know what it would take to structure the organization systematically for this new reality.
Yeah. So something that you just said, I think this is a very powerful point for us as the risk management community as well, because I have the same feelings inside the organizations that I worked with, is that when something external happens, and as a general rule, I hope most risk managers have some sort of like a morning newsletter with all the key points referencing the company and the industry, so they're at least aware of what's happening out there. I mean, if you don't, that's a good idea. Every company I've ever worked with, I have a morning setup where I just get the headlines of anything that is remotely kind of relevant to our industry or our company or our markets. And the feeling that I often have is that you see something like new tariffs or a change in local legislation, or legislation being sent for discussions, and it's expected to come into force in November or something. You see those things, and the system one thinking, this lizard brain of us, tells us that, well, supply chain, surely, the procurement team, surely they're thinking about this. They need to understand the implications. They of course they've got it under control. And then you're thinking, okay, well, we will also have some liquidity problems. Surely finance is thinking about that. And I think the big lesson for us is that they may or may not, but there's no harm in trying to consolidate this thinking and talk to different people and be proactive, and encouraging people to actually actively think about the implications and the prevention of whatever is coming around the corner. And on a number of occasions, I found that getting involved as the risk manager and trying to bring different people into the conversation actually completely changes the conversation. Because yes, maybe HR was, for example, COVID was a big example for me. I remember I kept pushing and pushing, saying we need a cross-functional work team to start thinking about the consequences and the preparedness. And senior executives were kept saying, we've got it under control. We're talking to HR about this on a daily basis. I'm going, but it's not an HR issue. It's not solely an HR issue. Supply chains are going to collapse. Our liquidity is going to collapse. Our port infrastructure is going to collapse. Our markets may completely close. It's much bigger than just human safety. Obviously, hugely important, but there's a very clear liquidity implications. There's refinancing implications. There's all sorts of other issues that need to be dealt with, and bringing then 10 executives into the room for every morning meeting for the next couple of months, that really made a difference, because we felt comfortable that everybody knew what's going on. Everybody was kind of on top of the developments and was not just reacting, but trying to take proactive steps. But this is such an interesting situation, because as the risk manager, you almost feel like somebody else should be doing that. It's their job. It's not really your job. And then I think that kind of complacency is something that is not helping us as risk professionals.
Well, and Alex, you described the key problems behind this reality, right? One is siloed organizations, right? You described what should be, you think, happening at the finance department versus supply chain department, et cetera, right? On the other hand, there hasn't been a meeting like this, right, where all the stakeholders come together and discuss that, right? And then there is the detection component of it, where something that happens in the environment that is relevant is escalated to the right folks. And yeah, of course, risk managers can be proactive and can take this on, but wouldn't it be better if it's part of a routine enterprise process, right?
Yes.
That does that, right? And of course, risk managers should be involved throughout this value chain, right? Because they're there at the beginning discussing with the group of folks who are responsible for that what should be on the list of the things that we watch. What is the relevance of that to our balance sheet, to our strategy, et cetera, right? So they are there in the beginning of this process, right? And then someone detects these things, assembles the right group, presents it. Risk managers have input into that process too, because now they're talking about scenarios and they're talking about how probability distributions change, et cetera. And then it's being carried on, right? So, but it's kind of hard to put this kind of a burden, um, extracurricular burden, mind you, right, on risk managers who have a lot of other stuff to do, right? And that's why it typically falls through the cracks. But what it illustrates is the need for different kinds of firm-wide processes where the right stakeholders are assembled, where you truly think about the important components of this value chain, right? And you bring the right folks with the right tools to do that. That is what's missing at most of organizations that we know.
I think what you've just said is so profound. I need to recap that, because this is so important. Because on one side you could have a superhero risk manager who monitors everything and brings everybody together and always initiates cross-functional meetings. But the reality is, of course, that is completely unsustainable. You may have a risk manager who is kind of picked up on an issue once, twice, three times, but there's everything is changing in the world. It's constantly evolving. There's so much stuff happening. It's just impossible to keep track. Um, the the sustainable solution is what you've described, is that we as risk professionals should be working on embedding this risk awareness and risk appreciation, and just thinking in terms of clarity and certainty and uncertainty into every business process. So when head of procurement sees a piece of news, in his or her mind, there's an immediately a thought: what does that mean for my supply chain? How much am I exposed to a particular market? Do I have a foreign currency exposure? It becomes natural to every individual. When they see something, they immediately kind of try to project that event onto their business model, onto their department actions, to see if they need to prevent something or preempt something.
Well, for lack of a better word, what you just described is a enterprise risk committee, right? That has all the right stakeholders and who is specifically designed to understand what's happening and react to it, right? Now, here's an interesting uh, another point that you raised, Alex, right? Which is something is happening, and all of a sudden you need to have this enterprise risk committee every Monday, right? So in the military, there's a term called battle rhythm. And the battle rhythm is how the organization operates in a routine way, but that battle rhythm intensifies or slows down depending on what's happening, right? There could be nothing going on in the marketplace for a year, so you don't need to have more than quarterly enterprise meetings, right? But all of a sudden COVID hits or Russia invades Ukraine, and all of a sudden you have to have them twice a week, right? But the process is the same, and the value chain from detection to assessment to response is the same, and the stakeholders are the same, and they're being trained in playing these important complementary roles, right? So that's the vision for a lot of this. How you then bring in probability distributions into that conversation? How do you expand strategy and planning to be more scenario based? How you bring in AI to connect the dots in that process, so that you are struggling with a particularly difficult phenomenon, and you start asking questions, right, of a specialized AI agent that is trained to be an expert in risk and strategy, et cetera, on how would you interpret that? What are the relevant case studies, right? So again, AI is an aid to judgment, and helping connect these complex phenomena, rather than a decision maker or someone who can play these roles, right? So that's how we envision, with this new generation of technology, in the new realization of the importance of risk in this process, how all of this is going to come together. But it will require visionary leaders and visionary board members to say, look, we just cannot continue operating structured for the environment of 1980s, when we're faced with these kinds of global forces.
And so I think Risk Awareness Week goes a long way to create the visionary leaders out of the risk community. And our audience, please take some of the select workshops that resonated with you during the Risk Awareness Week, because we have 37 or 38, I think, workshops over the coming 5 days. Take them to your board members and really kind of start spreading this risk awareness. This was the original design behind the Risk Awareness Week, trying to bring risk thinking to people that are used to an accounting way of thinking, where there's a single scenario, everything is a perfect number, it's all calculated, averages make sense, nobody's concerned about the flaw of averages, and so on. Now, you did say something very interesting, which, for me, this kind of big pivotal point was in 2009, when I first read Taleb's Fooled by Randomness, and then Doug Hubbard's, who's also one of the speakers, The Failure of Risk Management, Why It's Broken and How to Fix It. And for me, the big turning point was that I grew up, I have this weird diploma in risk management. I was one of the first 20 or 30 people in Australia to ever have a bachelor's degree in risk management, which was, again, ironic because they canceled the degree a few years later. So we were the guinea pigs in the failed experiment. But then I grew up in this universe of just risk management. And a lot of that universe is all about qualitative color coding, scoring, and a lot of just governance kind of play pretend, compliance theater. I then, in 2009, I discovered that there were parallel universes of decision science, of behavioral economics, of probability theory, of operations research. All of these fields have done more to contribute to the risk management than risk management textbooks have done. I would almost say, like, if anybody asks me what book should I read, I would say whatever doesn't have risk management in the title, because books on decision science and operations research probably have more to do with good risk decision making than the actual risk management textbooks. So you have this amazing experience with working with your co-author of your book, Agility, and you must have borrowed a lot from the fields surrounding, from intelligence world, from the military world. What are some of the kind of amazing ideas that stood the test of time that we can take and apply in our risk world?
Oh man, so much there. So interestingly enough, how folks think about risk and uncertainty is incredibly valuable to compare and contrast across different disciplines, right? Because in the military, more often than not, you think about phenomena that are more uncertainty rather than measurable risk, and that changes the emphasis from measurement of events that are recurring to thinking about events that have never happened before, right? So especially in the world that we are facing now, with some of the geopolitical uncertainties, technological uncertainties, societal transformations, we're dealing with events that have never happened before, right? And therefore, traditional risk management approaches may fail to begin with. And therefore, assigning likelihoods, okay, to events that constitute uncertainty rather than risk is one of the reasons why boards and executives feel such distrust and contempt for some of it, because it's useless by design, right? That's number one. Number two is thinking about these environments that Clausewitz calls fog and friction, and that is a combination of informational ambiguity and uncertainty, and thinking not only what it means for strategy, but thinking what it means for the organizational dynamics, in what happens within organizations that are faced with adversity, faced with random events, where plans fail the moment they encounter contact with the enemy, etc. Right? So that entire genre that is super connected to economics and Frank Knight, that is super connected to the discussions on complex adaptive systems, so many different fields that come together to think about it, right? Decision making under uncertainty is another one, right? Part of it comes from game theory, but part of it comes from behavioral economics. When it all finally arrives at the desk of the executives, it's still complex decision making under uncertainty with limited information. What are these set of tools that are best done that? And then there's a whole discussion on organizational processes that enable that. So the funnels and the enterprise risk committee that intensifies when needed and slows down when needed are all examples of these types of structures, as is the conversation about environmental intelligence or the role of wargaming in understanding black swans and things of that kind. So I think what makes this useful and makes it ready for this moment in time is the synthesis of all of these different fields that have come together over time to contribute to this conversation. And I feel we have the knowledge and we have the experience to do that. What is needed, again, are visionary leaders and board members on the other end who will say, I want to dedicate time and resources to revamp my organization for this new environment. And so that, again, for me, it becomes routine to detect, assess, and respond to change of any kind in any environment.
I like this idea very much, is that we really need to adapt our business models as organizations to a volatile environment. And it's in everything. It's in having the conversations about risks before signing contracts and renegotiating terms and conditions. It's about thinking about strategic assumptions in ranges and then running Monte Carlo to see what it means. It's talking about efficient frontiers and the chances of success. It's changing the way people think and changing the way organizations and the processes operate. So there's for example an inherently built-in step in any business plan, that business plans are done in ranges, or at least in some scenarios, and not just in a single scenario. Now, I wanted to quickly, before we wrap up with the final message to the risk community, I wanted to acknowledge some of the questions that the people have been asking us. And Mark Robinson confirms exactly what you're saying, that it's about game theory, wargaming, using these tools and techniques as well in the process. Brian is talking about the importance of simulating the effect of risks on cash flows and not just earnings. Basically, just recognizing that our key performance metrics, our key decision metrics, really are indeed ranges with different chances of success. Thank you for Samuel and Reginald for just picking up some of the quotes. I'm looking through the comments section, picking up some of the quotes that we talked about. Alejandro is asking, Leo, would you say there is a proactive risk intelligence and a reactive one?
For sure, absolutely, absolutely, and I think that's key. That in order to be able to get in front of the trends and disruption that we all want to, right? So we see at least some of these trends in the making, and we can react to that. It has to be proactive, and for it to be proactive, it has to be part of a process.
That's a very good point. Fabian is asking, he's saying, well, given that our companies are run and structured so individually and there's so much uniqueness in it, what would you say could be, the 2 or 3 things that most risk managers should consider that will work most of the time? What could be kind of the starting blueprint for trying to shift your organizational business model towards more risk awareness?
Revisit how you define risks across the organization and make sure that each one of them is observable, measurable, and manageable, right? That alone will transform the whole conversation, where from a governed risk that is called business continuity, that nobody knows what that is and what lives inside of it and how to manage it or how to observe it, right? You will have very specific dimensions of people, process, technology, cyber, etc., which are observable and are measurable and can be managed through a variety of tools, right? So how transforming your internal risk taxonomy, for lack of a better word, into something that is oriented toward decision making will transform this conversation, even in and of itself.
What else? What's the next step after the making risks? What's the word I'm looking for? Not transparent, but more understandable, more relatable, more practical. What else could happen? Because I do really like your idea about this enterprise committee, or maybe integrating that agenda item of talking about what's changing into an existing operational committee or an executive committee, for example.
Yeah, and it's part of a broader conversation on who and how observes the environment and then brings the relevant information to decision makers, right? So who at our organization is responsible for that? And if it's a bunch of silos, which what it typically is, how do we unify this in such a way that this knowledge is collected and then synthesized and then brought to bear?
Risk management integrates into the multidisciplinary, especially in the construction industry. The testing of assumptions is key, and also costing the risks as far as practical. So trying to understand the kind of the quantitative implications of changes in the assumptions on the cash flow or NPV or the valuation, the covenants, is super important. And I think that that comment really resonates and builds upon what we've been talking about. Now, in the last couple of minutes before we wrap up, thank you very much for sharing your experience with us. Final thoughts? What's your advice to the risk managers watching us at the moment?
Look, I think my biggest advice is try to raise this conversation from a very tactical level at which most risk managers tend to operate into strategic, and have the right conversation with senior executives in the board of what are some of the biggest issues, business issues, process issues that are on your mind, and how can the work and the investment in risk management can help with that, right? Because it's one thing to continue developing the tools and continue presenting them to senior executives. It could be more impactful to have a conversation about what are the business needs that remain unsolved and try to position the knowledge and experience and tools in this way. So that's what we try to do, right? We try to shape the needs and challenges at the enterprise level and then bring all of these tools that we discussed to solving them.
That last thought really resonates with me a lot, because in the previous company, our risk management agenda for the whole department was really shaped by two things. There are kind of risk management one expectations, things that we just need to keep on track and to do every year. For example, insurance renewals and policy documentation and some sort of external reporting for covenants. But then the biggest piece was really asking the shareholders and the senior managers what are some of the most critical decisions that they want to make in the coming months, where there's a lot of uncertainty, and kind of deep diving into that, the processes that support those decisions. That was one thing. And then another thing was, where are the biggest current risk losses? For example, if we're writing off a lot of sales, if we have bad debts, if we have liquidity issues, well, that's where risk managers can add value. So there's an important kind of learning exercise to try and find either what are the biggest upcoming challenges or decisions, or where the biggest losses are today that can be solved with risk management. Thank you very much, Leo. Any final thoughts? Any final goodbyes?
No, listen, congratulations on doing this. So much needed. And this is a very substantive, practical way of trying to bring aboard this entire community and, move it in the direction that would be useful for these organizations long term.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks to everyone who watched us, and thank you to everybody who asked questions in the comments. We haven't had a chance to respond to every single one of them, because the next workshop starts in 3 minutes, because I'm not very good at planning. I every single, like for the last 6 years, I just do it back to back for the whole week. But we will try to respond to your questions in writing in the chat afterwards. So thank you, everyone, and I'll see you in the next workshop. Thanks, Leo.
Great to be here.